The insult was not shouted. That was what made it so devastating. Mr. Aldous Kingswell delivered it the way a man slips a blade between ribs, quietly, with a smile still on his lips, in a room full of people who heard every word and chose, deliberately, to say nothing. It was the 28th of November, 1893. Lady Beatrice Ellsworth's winter assembly at Ashcroft Manor drew the finest names in 3 counties. Silk gowns, sweeping polished floors, crystal catching the light of 24 candelabras, the sound of a string quartet threading through the warmth of a room that smelled of pine boughs, candle wax, and expensive perfume. Clara Crawford stood near the musicians' platform in a gown the colour of faded rose. It had been well made once, the seams still held, the lace at the throat was still clean. What but fashion had moved on without her, the way everything had moved on without her, and she was aware of it in the way she was always aware of it. Not with despair, but with a quiet, bone-deep steadiness that had taken 20 years to grow. She had not wanted to come. She had come because Beatrice had written to her directly, warmly, and with enough genuine affection in the letter that refusing would have felt like ingratitude. Clara valued Beatrice. Beatrice was one of perhaps 4 people in England who still extended courtesy to her without reservation. She had accepted. She had pressed her gown. She had dressed her silver-threaded hair with care, pinned it neatly at the nape in the manner she had always worn it, and she had walked into Ashcroft Manor with her chin level and her hand still. She had done everything correctly. It was not enough. Kingswell had been watching her from the moment she arrived. She had felt it, the way one feels a draught through a closed window, not seeing it, but knowing it was there. He was a prosperous man in his mid-50s, tailored to the last button, his greying whiskers groomed to a point, his smile arranged with the kind of pleasantness that cost him nothing and meant less. He moved through society as though it were a property he managed, assessing, calculating, always deciding who was useful and who could safely be reduced. He had decided years ago what Clara Crawford was. She had been reaching for a glass of punch from the side table when he drew near enough for her to hear his voice carry sideways to the small cluster of gentlemen beside him, perfectly positioned, perfectly timed, and so that it landed like an accident when it was anything but. No gentleman of standing would trouble himself now, of course. She did not turn. Her hand did not tremble on the glass. Too old to tempt, too tainted to trust, and entirely too late for any man of consequence to risk his name beside hers. The Crawford disgrace never did wash out, did it? A fan stopped moving somewhere to her left. A footman pretended to study the floor. 2 young ladies exchanged a glance that was almost pity, and not quite enough to be called kindness. Clara set her glass down. She did not drink from it. She turned, slowly, and faced the room with the composure of a woman who had been practicing composure since before these young ladies were born. She had survived whispers, exile, and 2 decades of being treated as a cautionary tale in silk. Or she had outlasted cruelty before, and she would outlast it again. But her throat ached with the old familiar smoke of it, the shame she had not earned, rising in her chest as though it belonged there. Then a voice came from across the room, not raised, not theatrical, simply present in the way that certain voices are present, the kind that do not need to compete for silence, because silence arranges itself around them naturally. That will do, Kingswell. Every head turned. Rowan Knights, Duke of Thornfield, stepped away from the shadowed archway beside the library doors. He was tall, dark-haired, broad in the shoulders, dressed entirely in black save for the crisp white of his shirt and the silver buttons on his waistcoat. His features were severe without cruelty. A strong jaw, grey eyes the colour of winter sky before snow, an expression so controlled it read as dangerous in a room full of people used to performing their feelings for one another's benefit. He was not performing anything. He crossed the room at a measured pace, not rushing, not making a scene of the crossing, simply moving with the absolute authority of a man who had never once needed to explain himself, and did not intend to start tonight. He stopped at Clara's side, and in full view of every person present, every tilted head, every held breath, every pair of curious, avid, aristocratic eyes, he took her hand, not as a courtesy, not as a gesture of charity, as a choice. His voice, when he spoke, was low enough to feel personal and clear enough to carry precisely as far as the room required. "You are not too late for anything, Miss Crawford. In fact, you are exactly what I need." The room did not breathe. Kingswell's smile had not quite made it back to his face, and Clara Crawford, who had survived 20 years of being told her chapter was finished, stood in the gold light of Ashcroft Manor's grandest room, and felt, for the first time in a very long while, something she had carefully stopped permitting herself to feel. She felt seen. "Hold on, please. Let me check on you. How are you doing right now? Thank you so much for being here. It truly means the world. If this story is already pulling at your heart, and I know it is, please hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Share the video too. It helps more than you know. Thank you. Now let us get back to the story. Clara Crawford had not always been invisible to polite society. There had been a time, and she could still find the edges of it if she reached carefully into memory, when she had been simply a woman of modest but respectable standing, the daughter of a shipping merchant whose fortunes were never grand, but whose name was clean. Her father, Edmund Crawford, had loved his work with a devotion that left little room for social navigation. He had trusted the wrong men with the wrong documents at the wrong moment, and he had gone to his grave not quite understanding how a reasonable man, acting in good faith, had come to be spoken of as a debtor and a fool. Clara had been 36 when it happened. She was 56 now. 20 years was a long time to carry a name that society had decided to use as a warning. She had learned, in those years, at every shape that survival could take. She had taught arithmetic to the daughters of a clergyman in Shropshire. She had kept accounts for a widowed solicitor in Bath who paid her fairly and asked no personal questions. She had nursed a distant cousin through a long illness, and when that cousin died, she had packed her trunk, written 3 careful letters of application to households that required capable women, and moved on. She did not allow herself to hope for more than usefulness. Usefulness was a thing she could guarantee. Hope, she had found, had a habit of making the eventual absence of what one hoped for considerably worse. Beatrice Ellsworth had known Clara for many years, long before the scandal, and had never entirely let the friendship die. Not loudly, not in public, but in the quiet way of a woman who understood that loyalty cost her something and paid it regardless. It was Beatrice who had written to her in October with the invitation to the winter assembly. It was Beatrice who had seated her respectably at table, ensured she had a glass of something warm upon arrival, and introduced her to 2 younger women without apology or caveat. It was also Beatrice who had not been near enough to intervene when Kingswell found his moment. Clara had known Aldous Kingswell by reputation for years. She had not known, until that evening, the full weight of why his name made her uneasy. She had known only that he was prosperous, connected, and the sort of man who spoke of others' failures with a sympathy so smooth it was almost indistinguishable from contempt. After the Duke's intervention, as after the room had rearranged itself with the nervous energy of people who had witnessed something unprecedented and needed time to decide what it meant, Beatrice found Clara near the fireplace with a steadiness in her face that cost her rather more than it appeared. "Rowan Knights doesn't do things without reason," Beatrice said, low and quick, her fan working rapidly against the heat. "He is not impulsive. He is not kind in the empty way. Whatever he has just decided, he has decided it." Clara looked across the room. The Duke stood near the windows now, speaking with an elderly lord, his expression entirely composed, as though he had not just rearranged the social order of the room with 4 quiet sentences. "I do not know him," Clara said. "No," Beatrice replied, "but he appears to know of you. And in my experience, but when Rowan Knights pays attention to something, it is because he has already understood it more thoroughly than anyone else in the room." Before Clara could form a response, the Duke himself crossed to them. He bowed to Beatrice with the appropriate correctness, then turned to Clara with an attention that was not performative and not apologetic. He simply looked at her, directly, clearly, without the slight flinching quality that most people's eyes carried when they remembered who she was. "Miss Crawford," he said, "I wonder if you would permit me a brief word. I have a matter of some practical consequence that I believe may be of interest to you. Not a rescue, not a condescension. A matter of practical consequence." Clara straightened. "You may speak, Your Grace." "Thornfield Hall is in some disorder," he said. "My steward is competent but overwhelmed. I require someone of intelligence and discretion to manage estate correspondence and assist with household reform. The position is respectable, the remuneration fair, and the arrangement entirely above board. I am told you have considerable experience with accounts and administration." He was told. That meant he had inquired. That meant this was not the impulse of a gentleman embarrassed by Kingswell's cruelty. This was something else. Clara looked at him steadily. "You are told correctly, Your Grace." "Then I hope you will consider the offer," he said. "There is no obligation and no urgency beyond the ordinary requirements of a household that needs competent management. I will have my steward write to you with the particulars by the end of the week." He bowed again and withdrew, and Beatrice exhaled beside her, very softly. "Well," she said, after a moment, "that is either the most practical thing that has happened in this room all year, or it is the beginning of something considerably more interesting. I find I cannot yet determine which." Clara could not determine it either. But as she stood in the warm light of Ashcroft Manor, with the sound of the quartet rising behind her, and Kingswell's poisoned words still faintly ringing in her ears, she understood one thing clearly. She had not come this far by refusing to move forward. She would accept. The carriage brought her to Thornfield on a grey Tuesday morning in the first week of December, and the house appeared through the mist like something from a painting a person might study for a long while before deciding whether it was beautiful or sorrowful. It was certainly large. The stone was old, the colour of ash and honey, darkened at the corners where ivy had made its claim over several generations. The east wing was entirely sound and well-proportioned, the windows tall and clear. The west wing, even from the drive, showed the signs of long neglect. Shuttered windows, a section of balustrade missing from the upper terrace, a general quality of something important having been set aside and not returned to. Clara noted it all without judgment. She had spent enough time in houses that were managing difficulty to know that visible decline was rarely about indifference. It was usually about something heavier, loss, grief, or the particular paralysis of a person who knew exactly what needed doing and could not yet find the will to begin. The steward met her at the door. His name was Benedict Farrow. He was perhaps 50, lean-framed, with close-cut grey at his temples and the careful, measured quality of a man who had learned to be precise because imprecision had cost him once. He assessed her in the way a person assesses someone new to a place they are responsible for, not rudely, but thoroughly. "Miss Crawford," he said, "I am glad you have come. The house has needed organization." He paused as though the word were not quite adequate. "Among other things." "Then we shall begin with organization," Clara said, "and address the other things as they make themselves known." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "His Grace will receive you this afternoon. In the meantime, I have had the correspondence room prepared." The correspondence room was a small, but well-lit chamber off the main hall with a south-facing window and 2 large writing desks, both of which were buried under a geology of letters, ledgers, unopened notices, and what appeared to be at least 3 years of estate receipts, arranged in no particular order. Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. Then she took off her travelling coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, rolled her sleeves to the wrist, and began. She was still sorting when a voice came from behind her, bright and unannounced. "Oh, good. You are the sort who actually works. I was not certain." Clara turned. A young woman stood in the doorway, late 20s or thereabouts, with warm brown eyes, honey-coloured hair dressed neatly but without excess formality, and an expression of frank, uncomplicated delight at having found Clara in exactly this state. "I am Laura Ashworth," the woman said. "I am Rowan's cousin. Distant enough that I am not required to be formal about it. I came to Thornfield 3 months ago because my own household became somewhat impossible, and I have stayed because this one is considerably more interesting, despite, or perhaps because of, the quantity of unanswered letters." "Clara Crawford," Clara said. "I know who you are," Laura said pleasantly. "Rowan told me. He said you were the most capable person in the room at Beatrice's assembly, which from Rowan is approximately equivalent to a proclamation of national importance. He does not use that word." She stepped into the room, looked at the desk Clara had already half cleared, and nodded with approval. He was right, more evidently. Clara allowed herself something that was almost a smile. "He has set me a considerable task." "He sets everyone a considerable task," Laura said cheerfully. "It is his primary mode of expressing respect. You will learn this." The Duke received her at 4 o'clock in the library, which was the best room in the house by some distance. Warm, ordered, lined with shelves that showed evidence of actual use rather than decoration. He was standing when she entered, not seated in the manner of a man receiving a member of staff, but standing at the window with a book open in his hand, which he set aside without ceremony when she came in. "Miss Crawford, I hope the house has not frightened you." "It has not, Your Grace." "Good. It frightened some people." He gestured to the chair opposite his. "The house is sound. The management has been less so. Benedict is excellent at the practical work of an estate, but the administrative correspondence has accumulated beyond what one person can sensibly manage, and I need someone who can read the situation clearly and bring order to it without requiring constant direction. I am told this describes you precisely." Again, he had been told. Clara filed this away. "I have begun on the correspondence room," she said. "It will take me approximately 4 days to sort and catalogue what is there. After that, I can give you a clear account of what requires immediate attention." He looked at her. Not with surprise, exactly. More with the expression of a man who has formed an expectation and found it confirmed. 4 days, he said. "Very good." He paused. "I should tell you, Miss Crawford, that I do not run this house on ceremony. I require accuracy, reliability, and honesty. I do not require deference beyond what is necessary for the household to function well. If you find something that concerns you, well, I expect you to say so plainly. I will, Your Grace. Then we understand each other. He picked up his book again. The conversation was, apparently, complete. Clara rose, smoothed her skirt, and went back to the correspondence room. Benedict was waiting in the corridor with a fresh candle and something that was, unmistakably, a look of cautious relief. "He did not alarm you," Benedict said. "No," said Clara. "He alarms most people," Benedict said. "Most people," Clara said, "are alarmed by directness because they are not accustomed to it. I find directness considerably less exhausting than its alternative." Benedict looked at her for a moment. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, he smiled properly. "Quite so," he said. "Quite so, Miss Crawford." By the end of the first week, Clara had transformed the correspondence room from catastrophe into order. Letters filed chronologically, tenant complaints separated from social correspondence, financial records stacked by quarter and year, outstanding notices given a ledger page of their own. The surface of both desks was visible for the first time in what Benedict estimated, with some embarrassment, was nearly 3 years. She had also formed opinions, which she kept to herself for the time being. The first was that Thornfield Hall was not a house in decline, because its owner had failed it. It was a house that had been managed by committee, various distant relations, an absent land agent, and at least 2 individuals whose competence did not match their confidence, while Rowan himself had been occupied with matters in London, or matters he had apparently not shared in detail with anyone at Thornfield. The second was that several of the outstanding correspondence items were not simply overdue. They were irregular. Tenant rents recorded in one ledger did not match those recorded in the secondary accounts book. A lease agreement for a parcel of land on the estate's southern edge had been renewed at a rate significantly below what the other comparable leases reflected. The name on that agreement was one she did not yet recognize. She noted it and continued working. The Duke came to the correspondence room on the 5th morning, unannounced, with a cup of tea in each hand, a detail so unexpected that Clara looked at the cups twice before understanding what was happening. "Benedict is occupied with the south barn," Rowan said, setting one cup near her without ceremony. "You have been here since before 7. "The correspondence does not sort itself, Your Grace." He looked at the desk, then at the neatly labelled shelves she had organized along the left-hand wall. His expression did not change, but there was something behind it, a recognition, perhaps, of how much had been done in a very short time. "You found the quarterly ledgers," he said. "I did. The 1891 and 1892 records are complete. 1893 has gaps." She paused. "There are also some inconsistencies I would like to understand before I raise them formally." He looked at her. "Inconsistencies. In the tenant accounts. I may be misreading to them." "You do not strike me," he said, "as a woman who misreads things." A quiet hovered between them, not uncomfortable. Clara picked up her tea. "I will have something clearer for you by the end of the week." He nodded and left. The days took on a rhythm. Clara worked the mornings in the correspondence room, took a brief luncheon with Laura, who had appointed herself Clara's social education in the ways of Thornfield with a cheerfulness that made the whole business feel less like survival, and more like something that might eventually resemble ordinary life. "He was not always this contained," Laura said one afternoon, over tea in the morning room, her feet tucked under her on the chair in a manner that would have horrified any drawing-room observer. "When his father died, and then well, there were things." And he closed himself in rather thoroughly. "Most people read it as coldness. It is not coldness." "No," Clara said. She had already understood this. Or she had watched him with the indoor staff, Fair, clear, never unkind. She had watched him receive a tenant farmer whose roof had collapsed in the October rains, and she had seen him arrange immediate repair, not because protocol required it, but because the man had 4 small children, and the conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes. He was not cold. He was simply a man who had learned to be economical with himself, the way people do when they have spent some portion of their life being taken advantage of or deeply disappointed. Clara understood this more than she could say. The chemistry between them developed the way genuine things develop, without announcement. She would bring him a question about a document, and they would find themselves discussing it for 20 minutes. But he had opinions about estate management that were quietly radical for someone of his position, preferring long-term stability over immediate extraction of income, caring about the material well-being of his tenant families in ways the London social circuit would have considered eccentric. She found this interesting. She found him interesting. She told herself this was entirely professional. She was not yet willing to examine how thoroughly she did not believe herself. It was Laura who drew it out of her. Not deliberately and not unkindly. Laura was constitutionally incapable of unkindness, but with the easy, open manner of a woman who assumed honesty was simply the most efficient way of knowing a person. They had been walking the East Garden in the thin winter light of a Tuesday afternoon, and the bare branches of the oak lay overhead like dark stitching against a pale sky, when Laura said, quite simply, "Will you tell me what happened? The real version, I mean. Not the one society invented." Clara was quiet for a moment. The gravel path crunched beneath their feet. "My father was Edmund Crawford," she said at last. "He was not a brilliant businessman. He was an honest one, which is not always the same thing. In 1872 he became involved in a small shipping venture, a partnership with 2 other merchants and a minor financier. The venture failed. That is unremarkable. Many ventures fail." She paused. The memory was old enough now that it did not bleed, but it still pressed. What was remarkable was what happened after. There were letters produced, correspondence between my father and one of the other partners, that implied my father had knowingly misrepresented the cargo valuations. The implication was fraud. And alongside the financial question, there appeared a secondary story, that I myself had been conducting myself improperly with the financier. A man named Carew. A married man. Laura made a small, sharp sound. There was no truth in either charge, Clara said evenly. My father had not falsified anything, and I had met Carew twice, once at a business supper in my father's home, and once at a public assembly. The correspondence attributed to me was forged. The witnesses to my alleged impropriety were either mistaken or paid. "But you did not fight it," Laura said. Not an accusation, a question. "I tried to," Clara said. "I wrote letters. I produced what evidence I had. I appealed to 3 solicitors, and I discovered very quickly that once a story of that kind has attached itself to a woman's name, the telling of her side becomes indistinguishable to most people from protest. And protest, as you may know, is routinely read as guilt." They walked in silence for a moment. "So you withdrew," Laura said. "I withdrew," Clara said. "I left London. I built a different life, a smaller life, a useful life, and I refused, absolutely refused, to allow it to make me bitter, because bitterness would have been a second ruination, and one that nobody else could be blamed for." Laura stopped walking. She took Clara's arm in both her hands with a firmness that was also, somehow, gentle. "The financier," she said. "Carew. Dead now," Clara said. "'Twere 12 years past. And the other partner, the one who would have benefited from the fraud being attributed to your father?" Clara looked at her steadily. "That is the question I have been asking myself," she said quietly, "since I began reading the Thornfield ledgers." Laura's expression shifted. "Why?" "Because the name on the Southern Parcel lease, the lease renewed at the irregular rate, is Kingswell." The garden was very quiet. A blackbird called somewhere in the bare oak branches. Laura's eyes had gone quite still. "Aldous Kingswell," she said. "Yes," said Clara. That evening, for the first time since she had arrived at Thornfield, Rowan Knight told her something that was not related to estate accounts or household management. He had encountered her in the corridor outside the library, and instead of passing with the brief nod that was his usual evening acknowledgement, he paused. "I owe you an honesty," he said. "I knew your name before the assembly. Not personally, through correspondences. Tenant families in the network of estates around here speak of one another's affairs with more detail than one might expect. Your father's case was mentioned to me perhaps 4 years ago in a different context. I found it insufficient. The evidence against him was insufficient. It was managed to appear otherwise." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you are beginning to find it yourself," he said simply. "And I would rather you have the whole picture when you do." He went into the library. The door did not close fully behind him. Clara stood in the corridor and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the man who had stepped forward at Ashcroft Manor had not done so on impulse. He had done so because he already knew. Kingswell's first move against Clara's presence at Thornfield was subtle enough to be almost admirable, had it not been so calculated. The story, as it travelled through 3 counties in the fortnight following the winter assembly, was this. The Duke of Thornfield had taken pity on an impoverished, disgraced woman of advanced age by finding her a position in his household. It was charitable, of course. One could not fault the impulse. But one did wonder whether it was quite wise, given her history, to place such a person in a position of administrative trust. Certain men of business had encountered the Crawford name before. Certain records suggested certain questions. It was precisely the kind of story that could not be directly refuted, because it contained no direct accusation. Clara heard it second-hand through Laura, who reported it with a combination of fury and precision that Clara found both touching and practically useful. "He is testing whether Rowan will distance himself," Laura said, pacing the morning room with the contained energy of a woman who wished she had something more physical to do than sit still and be angry. "If Rowan retreats even slightly, if he qualifies your position, if he becomes careful in how he speaks of you in public, Kingswell wins the round without having thrown a single documented punch." "Does the Duke know?" Clara asked. "Rowan knows everything that happens in this county," Laura said. "He simply chooses his responses carefully." The response, as it turned out, was an invitation to Lady Juliana Hartwell's winter luncheon, extended to Clara directly by Juliana herself, with Rowan's name attached to the party. Juliana Hartwell was 32, beautiful in the composed, deliberate way of women who have been told they are beautiful for so long they have decided to make it useful. She was sharp, well-read, and occupied a curious middle position in county society. Younger than its established powers, too clever to be fully at ease with its shallower currents, and watchful in the way of someone still deciding which shore to swim toward. The luncheon was 12 women, a bright fire, and the particular quality of conversation that occurs when people are being polite with considerable effort. Clara was seated across from a widow of about her own age, named Mrs. Gwendolen Alcott, who had the quality of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity she intended to use promptly. She began pleasantly enough, asking about Thornfield's management, commenting on the difficulties of large estates in the current economy, And then, with the seamlessness of long practice, "It must be a considerable comfort to have found such a situation, Miss Crawford. I imagine stability becomes rather urgent at a certain point in life." The table went slightly still in the way that tables do when people are listening without appearing to. Clara set down her fork with the most unhurried movement she had ever performed. "Stability is always welcome, Mrs. Alcott," she said pleasantly. "Though I confess I find urgent rather an imprecise word. Those who require urgency are generally those who have failed to build anything of their own worth keeping. I have been fortunate enough to avoid that particular predicament." A silence followed. Then Juliana Hartwell, at the head of the table, pressed her lips together in what was not quite a smile but was clearly its immediate neighbour. Mrs. Alcott found a great deal to occupy her attention in her soup for the remainder of the meal. On the drive home, Laura sat beside Clara in the carriage and said nothing for approximately 4 minutes, which was a personal record. Then, those who require urgency are generally those who have failed to build anything worth keeping. She paused. "I am going to write that down when I get home." "It is only true," Clara said. "Truth delivered like that," Laura said warmly, "is considerably more interesting than a great many other things." Rowan, when Laura relayed the exchange to him that evening, said nothing. But he looked across the drawing room to where Clara was reading by the fire, and his expression, just for a moment, was not controlled at all. It was something simpler and more direct than control. Laura noticed. She was careful not to say so. January brought hard frost, and the kind of clarity that only comes when the air itself seems stripped of pretense. Clara had been at Thornfield 6 weeks, and she had found the thread she was looking for, but now she needed to know how far it ran. She brought her findings to Benedict on a Thursday morning, not to the Duke, not yet, because she needed a second pair of eyes on the ledgers before she placed something this serious before Rowan and claimed to be certain of it. Benedict spread the papers across the correspondence room desk and studied them in a silence that lasted long enough for Clara to understand he was being careful rather than slow. "The lease," he said finally. "The Southern Parcel lease," Clara confirmed. "Renewed in 1891 at 12 shillings per acre, while every comparable lease on the estate renewed between 14 and 16. The land agent's signature on the renewal is Thornfield's former agent, who left rather abruptly in the autumn of that year." "Pemberton," Benedict said quietly. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He left because Rowan had questions about certain property matters that Pemberton seemed unable to answer without considerable alteration of his previous answers." "Was Kingswell connected to Pemberton?" Benedict was quiet for a moment. "I cannot prove it. But Pemberton purchased a property in Wiltshire within 4 months of leaving Thornfield, a property that seemed, at the time, somewhat beyond his means." Clara straightened. "There is something else." She drew out a separate sheaf of letters, copies she had made from the originals in the estate archive, written in a clear, steady hand that she had come to recognize as Kingswell's through the assembly correspondence Beatrice had shared with her. "These are letters between Kingswell and 4 separate families in the surrounding district. Each of them is framed as advice and assistance. Each of them contains language, subtle but consistent, that appears to offer financial support while actually securing Kingswell a claim on the family property should a debt go unresolved." Benedict read them. His expression grew very still. "He has been doing this for years," he said. "I believe so," Clara said. "And I believe my father's case was not exceptional. I believe it was the earliest version of something he has repeated many times since, always targeting families or individuals who lacked the social weight to fight back effectively." A silence fell in the room. Outside, the January wind moved against the windows. "Laura spoke with 3 women last week," Benedict said slowly, as though assembling something aloud. "Widows in the main. She told me they had mentioned Kingswell in connection with financial arrangements they did not fully understand at the time of signing." Clara nodded. "She mentioned it to me as well. I believe she understood what she was looking for, even if she didn't say so directly. She is more perceptive than she allows people to realize," Benedict said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "It is a very effective quality." They presented the findings to Rowan that evening. He read everything in the same unhurried silence with which he did most things, and when he had finished, he set the papers down and looked at Clara with an expression that had something in it she could not quite name. "This is enough to take to a magistrate," he said. "Not to convict, not yet, but enough to initiate a formal inquiry." "If we move too quickly," Clara said, "he will know we have found him and destroy whatever we do not already have." "Yes," Rowan said, "which is why we will not move until we have everything." He looked at the papers again. "Miss Crawford, you have been in this house 6 weeks, and you have found what 2 years of general unease could not name. I am, not for the first time since your arrival, extremely glad you came." It was not an extravagant speech. Clara suspected extravagance was not in his natural register. But she felt it, the way one feels warmth after a very long cold, not dramatically but fully, in the place where dramatic words never quite reach. The storm came in from the west on the last Friday of January, arriving without the gradual courtesy of most English weather and making itself entirely at home within the hour. The windows of Thornfield shook. The candles in the hall guttered. Benedict secured the outbuildings with 3 of the indoor men, while Laura retreated to her room with a book and the philosophical position that storms were the world's opinion of the day, and one was best not to argue. Clara had been working late in the Old West Library, where she had been cross-referencing the estate maps against the lease records, and had not noticed the storm properly until the sky had gone the color of pewter, and the light in the room had become insufficient for close reading. She rose to fetch a lamp from the corridor, and found Rowan already in the doorway with one. "The North Road will be impassable within the hour," he said. He brought the lamp to the reading table without being asked, and looked at the maps she had spread out. "Till you have found the boundary discrepancy. The southern parcel as drawn on the 1878 map and the southern parcel as described in Kingswell's 1891 lease are not the same parcel," Clara said. "The lease describes an area approximately 2 acres larger than the original plot. The additional land borders the river access point." He was quiet for a moment, studying the maps. "River access," he said. "For a man interested in shipping interests, that would be considerable." "For a man interested in the kind of shipping interests he has been quietly acquiring in the past 4 years, it would be essential," Clara said. "I found 3 additional company registrations in the correspondence archive, all connected to Kingswell by name or by the name of his solicitor." The storm pressed against the glass, but Rowan sat in the chair across the table from her, the first time she realized that he had sat in the same room with her without a desk between them, as the formal excuse for the proximity. They were silent for a while, in a way that had stopped being the silence of professional restraint and had become something Clara was not yet ready to name. Then Rowan said quietly, "Tell me what it cost you. The 20 years." Clara looked up. He was watching her in the lamplight, with the still, direct attention that she had come to understand was not cold, but simply genuine. He did not dress his attention up in social convention. He simply paid it, fully, and let it be what it was. "It cost me a great deal," she said, after a moment. Not comfort. I managed comfort well enough. Not purpose. I was always useful to someone. But it cost me the expectation that life owed me anything other than what I could make of it. I stopped expecting kindness. I stopped believing I had any right to it. She paused. That sounds like it ought to be wisdom, she said. And perhaps it is. But the part of me that stopped expecting is also the part of me that stopped hoping, and the two are not as easily separated as one might wish. Rowan looked at the lamp for a moment. The storm said something inarticulate to the windows. I have not been good at this, he said, in the same tone one uses for precise statements about things that matter. At permitting people near enough to make any difference. I was not always this way. There were things that made me careful, and I became more careful than the things required, and then the carefulness became its own habit. Clara looked at him. You are not cold, she said. You simply stopped allowing people to see that you are not. He looked at her. Something in his expression was entirely unguarded for precisely one moment. Then it settled again, but softer than before, as though the guard had been adjusted rather than replaced. You are, he said, the most accurately observant person I have ever encountered. I have had 20 years to become observant, she said. There is very little else to do when society has decided you are not worth speaking to. He reached across the table, not reaching for the maps, not reaching for any document. He placed his hand over hers, briefly, steadily, without theatrics. It was wrong, he said. What was done to you, not simply incorrect or wrong. Clara did not say anything for a moment. Her throat had become inconveniently full. Then she turned her hand under his, briefly, and the storm continued outside, and the lamp burned between them, and neither of them moved away. That night, after the storm had quieted and the house had settled, Rowan found her in the corridor outside the library as she was finally going to her room. He stopped. She stopped. He said nothing immediately. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her temple, very quietly, the way a man acts when he has decided something he has been resisting for some time and has stopped seeing any sense in the resistance. Clara closed her eyes. When she opened them, he had gone, but the warmth of it remained, very precisely, like a lamp left burning in an empty room. March arrived, and with it, Lady Juliana Hartwell's spring charity assembly, a grander affair than her winter luncheon, open to the broader county set, with 3 rooms given over to music, dancing, and the particular form of social warfare that the English aristocracy had spent centuries refining to the point where it resembled, to the uninformed eye, a perfectly pleasant evening. Clara had not wanted to attend. Rowan had looked at her steadily and said that Kingswell would be there, and that the evidence they had gathered was now sufficient to act upon, and that it would be considerably better to act in a public setting than to give Kingswell the privacy in which to maneuver. He will attack first, Clara said. He knows we have been looking. Yes, Rowan agreed. Let him. She wore blue. Laura had insisted, and Clara had not had the energy to resist Laura when she had made up her mind about something, a force of nature that happened to wear very nice shoes. The gown was deep midnight blue velvet, with black lace at the throat and wrists. It was current in cut and uncompromising in colour. Clara looked at herself in the mirror before they left and thought, I am 56 years old, and I have earned the right to wear blue. She did not look like a woman who had been defeated. The assembly rooms were warm and brilliantly lit. Juliana received them at the door with the particular attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting, and her eyes moved from Clara to Rowan and back again, with a quality that suggested she was completing a calculation she had begun at the winter luncheon, or Kingswell made his move approximately 40 minutes into the evening. He chose his ground carefully. A moment when Rowan was momentarily in conversation with an older lord near the windows, and Clara was standing with Laura and 2 other women slightly removed from the main press of the room. He approached with the social ease of a man entirely confident in his welcome, and he smiled at Clara with the particular smile that contained everything except warmth. "Miss Crawford," he said pleasantly, loudly enough for the surrounding guests to register without turning visibly to look. "I must say, Thornfield suits you rather better than a woman of your situation might have expected. One wonders, of course, what exactly the Duke's motives are in keeping so close a connection with a woman of your particular history. A man of his standing, and risking his name on, well, sentiment is admirable. Whether it is wise is another question." The nearby conversations did not stop. They just quieted, fractionally, the way they do. Clara turned to face him. She was entirely calm. She had been preparing for this. Not the specific words, but the quality of it. The attempt to reframe her presence at Thornfield as something compromising, to make Rowan's association with her a liability he should retreat from. She opened her mouth. "I believe," said Rowan's voice, very quietly and very close, "that the question of my motives is mine to answer." He had crossed the room. He stood beside Clara in the way he always stood beside her now. Not in front of her. Not behind, but beside, as though they occupied the same ground by mutual understanding. He produced, from the inside of his evening coat, was a folded document. He held it in such a manner that Kingswell and the several guests who had now, inevitably, turned to observe, could see that it was a formal legal correspondence. "I have here," Rowan said, in a voice that carried the room without any elevation of volume, "a report from a London solicitor, retained by myself and 2 independent witnesses, documenting a series of financial irregularities in estate leasing agreements, fraudulent property boundaries, and a pattern of coercive correspondence targeting widowed and single women over a period of not less than 12 years. He looked at Kingswell. "Your name appears in this document considerably more than is comfortable." Kingswell's smile did not so much fall as dissolve. The original scandal attached to the Crawford name in 1873, Rowan continued, was engineered through forged correspondence and managed witness testimony. Miss Crawford's father was innocent of the charges brought against him. Miss Crawford was innocent of every accusation made against her. The individuals responsible are named, the evidence is documented, and I intend to ensure the appropriate legal authority reviews every page of it. The room was very still. Then Rowan turned to Clara, not away from Kingswell with dismissal, but toward her with intention, and said clearly, without qualification, "Miss Crawford has more intelligence, courage, and moral decency than any person in this room who ever permitted themselves to believe otherwise. I do not keep her close out of sentiment or charity. I keep her close because she is the only person I have ever met in whose company I am entirely certain that what I see is entirely true. And I intend to ask her," he added, with the faintest shift in tone that was not quite a smile but was its close neighbour, "to be considerably more than my household administrator, if she will permit the change in arrangement." Juliana Hartwell, at the far end of the room, set down her glass with a small, deliberate click that sounded, in the silence, like applause. Laura, beside Clara, pressed her hand briefly and said nothing, which was entirely unlike her, and which meant she was, in fact, very moved. Kingswell said nothing at all. His colour had gone the grey-white of a man who has run a very long game and has just understood it is over. Clara looked at Rowan Knights, Duke of Thornfield, or who was watching her with the expression of a man who has placed everything he values on a single honest statement and is waiting, steadily, to learn what that is worth. She said, very quietly, so that only he could hear. We will discuss the change in arrangement when we are not providing the assembly with its most entertaining 10 minutes of the decade. His mouth, finally, properly, curved into a smile. A real one, unguarded and warm, and entirely his own. "Agreed," he said. Kingswell moved quickly once he understood the game was up. Quick and desperate are not usually a combination that produces careful decisions, and his decision was neither careful nor particularly original. But it was dangerous, and the Records House was a stone outbuilding on the northeast corner of the Thornfield grounds, originally a grain store in the previous century, repurposed by Rowan's grandfather into a repository for estate documents going back nearly 100 years. It held, among other things, the original leasing agreements, the correspondence archive Clara had been working from, and the bound volume of copied financial records that Benedict had quietly removed from the estate ledger room and secured there for safekeeping 3 weeks earlier. The fire began at 20 minutes past 11 on a Thursday evening in March. Benedict saw the light from his window first. He was dressed and out the door in under a minute, calling for the outdoor men as he went. Clara, whose room faced the same direction, was 30 seconds behind him. Rowan was already in the corridor when she opened her door. "The Records House," he said. His voice was very controlled. "Benedict has gone in," she said. She knew this already, somehow, without seeing it, because it was the kind of thing Benedict would do. He would go in for the ledgers. He would not leave them. Rowan moved. Clara moved with him. The outbuilding had old, dry timber in the rafters, and the fire had caught with enthusiasm. The stone walls would hold, but the interior was another matter. The door stood open, Benedict had gone in, and smoke was pouring from the high window on the east face. Rowan went to the door. "I'm going in," he said. "You cannot go alone," Clara began. "I am not asking permission." He turned to the 2 outdoor men who had arrived behind them. "Go to the pump. Get water on the roof timbers. Or now." He went in. Clara stood at the door for 3 seconds. The smoke was thick, but the interior was still visible, the shelves of records on the far wall still intact, the fire concentrated in the northeast corner where the old dry beams had taken first. She could see the shape of Benedict near the shelves, and she could see that he had the bound volume in his arms but was on his knees, overcome by the smoke. She tied her shawl over her nose and mouth and went in after them. The heat was intense and immediate. She kept low, the way she had read was best for smoke, and crossed the floor in a direct line to where Benedict had fallen. She got her hands under his arm. He was conscious but not able to rise on his own. Then Rowan was there, on Benedict's other side, quite already lifting, and the 3 of them went out through the door in one ungainly, urgent mass and collapsed onto the gravel of the yard in the cold March air. Clara coughed until her eyes streamed. Benedict was doing the same. Rowan, beside her, was ash-streaked and smoke-dark, breathing hard, and the first thing he did when he had caught his breath was reach over and put his hand on her face, checking her for burns with the focused attention of a man who is managing fear by giving it a practical task. "I told you to stay at the door," he said. "You did not tell me that," Clara said, her voice rough from smoke. "You told the men to fetch water. You said nothing to me at all." "I intended it to be implied. You should have been clearer." She looked at him steadily, but even through the streaming eyes and the raw throat, and the heat still pressing from the outbuilding behind them. "And I would not have listened regardless." Something in his expression broke open, not in a dramatic way, quietly, the way walls come down when it is the right time for them. Benedict, on the ground beside them, clutched the bound volume to his chest and said, with the dry composure of a man who has just been dragged from a burning building and would like everyone to understand he is perfectly in command of himself. "I have them, every page." "Of course you do," Clara said. "I rather thought you might go in after me," Benedict said, in a tone that was almost an apology. "I'm sorry for it. I did not move quickly enough." "You moved quite quickly enough," Clara said, "not given that you were rescuing 20 years' worth of evidence." He looked at her with an expression that contained, beneath its careful surface, something old and genuine. A guilt about a time before this, about another woman he had not managed to reach in time, laid down at last in the carrying of this. The magistrate arrived within the hour, brought by a combination of Laura's unerring instinct for exactly when legal intervention becomes necessary, and Beatrice, who had driven to Thornfield the moment the assembly dispersal the following day had made the full picture clear to her, and who had brought with her written testimony from 2 of the women who had spoken to Laura. Kingswell was found at an inn, 3 miles from the estate, having arranged for 2 men to see to the fire on his behalf. He had underestimated, in the end, of the speed at which Thornfield could organize itself when it had a reason to. He was taken into custody before midnight. April came in gently, the way April does when winter has been long enough that even the light seems to arrive with apology. The Thornfield gardens, which had been bare when Clara arrived, were now showing the first green of things that had been dormant and had simply been waiting for conditions to change. Clara understood this very well. The formal inquiry into Kingswell's affairs took 3 weeks, assisted by the solicitor Rowan had retained, and the magistrate who had taken the original testimony with the deliberateness of a man who understood that cases of this kind required care. The bound volume Benedict had rescued from the fire provided the central documentary spine. The testimonies of 7 women, some brought forward by Laura, some who came once the news began to move through the county, provided the human evidence that gave the documents their full weight. Kingswell's legal standing was dismantled with the quiet, thorough efficiency of a process that has enough evidence not to need to hurry. His property interests were frozen pending further inquiry. His social standing, which had been the real currency of his power, collapsed the way such things collapse, not all at once, but in a series of doors that no longer opened and invitations that failed to arrive. Those who had enabled him, the former land agent Pemberton, a solicitor in London who had witnessed several of the forged documents, or a second man who had served as a paid witness in Clara's father's case, were each named in the inquiry report and faced their own proceedings accordingly. Juliana Hartwell, to no one's particular surprise once they thought about it, proved to be a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity to be on the right side of something important. She gave her drawing room over to one of the formal hearings, with a gracious hospitality that contained, beneath it, the satisfaction of a person doing exactly what they should. Mrs. Alcott sent Clara a letter of apology. Clara read it twice, accepted its sincerity, replied with courtesy, and did not feel it necessary to labor the point beyond that. Bitterness, she had long known, was a heavier weight than mercy. Benedict. At once the matter was settled, and Thornfield had returned to its more ordinary rhythms, found Clara in the correspondence room one morning, a room now so ordered and functional that it bore no resemblance to the catastrophe she had walked into in December. "I want to tell you something," he said, with the careful manner of a man who has been deciding whether to speak for some time. In 1881, there was a young woman employed at a neighboring estate. A similar situation, a false accusation, a reputation destroyed, nowhere to go. I was in a position to speak up for her, and I did not. I told myself the evidence was uncertain. The truth was, I was afraid of the professional consequences. He paused. She did not recover from it, as you have recovered. She did not have the resources. She left the county, and I never knew what became of her. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You went into a burning building for me," she said quietly. "It was insufficient," he said. "It was also," she said, "exactly what was needed. Do not mistake the two." He nodded, slowly, and left her to her work. The proposal came on a Thursday evening. Not at a formal occasion, not arranged for an audience. In the library, where they had spent so many evenings working through documents and discovering, alongside the evidence of Kingswell's crimes, the steadier, less easily catalogued evidence of what they were to each other. Clara was reading. Rowan was at his desk. The fire was well built, and the room was warm, and the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. He set down his pen and said, "But without preamble, I should like to marry you, if you are willing." She looked up from her book. He met her eyes directly, the way he always did. Not because society expects it after a public declaration. Society's expectations are of no particular interest to me, as I believe you have observed, and not because of the scandal or the need for formality, though I understand the practical weight of both. I am asking because I do not wish to imagine the next portion of my life without you in it, because the house is better with you here, because I am better, demonstrably, measurably better, than I was before you arrived, and because there is no other person in my acquaintance whose company I prefer to yours in any circumstance at any hour. He paused. I am also aware, he said, with the particular quality that was as close as he came to humour in formal moments, that you are entirely capable of managing without me, and that you are not asking me for rescue. I am asking you because I want to, because you are worth asking, because you have always been worth asking, and because I would like the answer very much to be yes. Clara looked at him across the library, in the firelight, in the house that had become, without her intending it, without her having allowed herself to hope for it, something that felt precisely like home. She thought of the winter assembly, the cold of Kingswell's words, the long, quiet years of making herself useful and not allowing herself to want more than usefulness could give. She thought of 20 years of a life lived at the margins of something larger, and then she thought of what it had felt like to walk into Thornfield in December and discover that the margins were not, after all, where she was required to remain. She set down her book. "Yes," she said. And because it was him, and because it was true, and because she had spent long enough being economical with herself to know the cost of it, I would like the answer to be yes. Very much indeed. He rose from his desk and came to her, and this time there was no storm outside, and no professional excuse, and no guard that either of them required, and when he took her face in his hands, it was with the careful certainty of a man who has found the thing he was looking for, and intends to be worthy of it. There was a question, when the engagement became known, about children. Clara had privately set it aside. She was 56, as uncertain things she had long assumed were no longer within the territory of her expectations. The assumption was wrong. The discovery came in June, confirmed by a physician in the 4th week of that month, who made his pronouncements with the careful professional manner of a man who knows he is delivering news outside his patient's expectations, and has decided to let the facts make their own case without embellishment. Clara sat with it for an afternoon. Then she told Rowan. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for her hand, the same steady, deliberate reaching she had come to know as his particular mode of saying the things that words did not quite cover. "Well," he said finally, as in the tone of a man who has encountered something that exceeds the reach of any prepared response, and has decided to simply be honest about being astonished. "Well, "I require somewhat more than well," Clara said. He looked at her. The astonishment had become, in the space of 2 sentences, something that was a great deal warmer. "I am," he said, "more grateful than I know how to say. And I expect I shall spend the next several decades working out how to say it adequately." "Several decades," she said. "You intend to keep me?" "Indefinitely," he said. "I thought that had been established." She laughed. A real one, full and unguarded, the kind she had forgotten she was capable of producing. The child was born in February of 1895, a boy, strong and loud, and possessed from the first hours of his life of an expression of determined inquiry that Laura said was entirely his mother's, and Rowan did not bother to dispute. He was named Edmund, after Clara's father. On the day of the christening, held at the Thornfield Chapel, with Beatrice and Laura as witnesses, and Benedict standing very straight in the second pew, with an expression he had been trying for some time to arrange into simple dignity, and had mostly achieved, Clara stood at the font with her son in her arms, and her husband beside her, and thought, not of the winter assembly, not of Kingswell, not of the long, cold years of managing without hope. She thought of the spring, of how it had come in quietly, after the long winter, with no particular announcement, how things that had seemed dormant had simply been waiting, how the conditions, changed at last, had let them grow. Edmund Knights, heir to Thornfield, blinked at the chapel light with the equanimity of someone who has arrived somewhere new and has decided, provisionally, to approve of it. His mother looked down at him with a steadiness and a warmth that she had spent 20 years convincing herself she did not need, and discovered now that she had simply been saving. Before we leave this story where it belongs, have you ever been underestimated, overlooked, made to feel as though your time had passed? Then this story was for you. Support stories like this one with your subscription, your like, your comment, and your share. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because every voice in this community matters more than you know. If Clara's journey stayed with you, pass this story on to someone who needs that reminder tonight. And so Clara Crawford, the woman society had once dismissed as too old and too ruined for any man, did not simply find love. She found evidence. She found justice. She found a house that needed her, and a man who chose her, and a future that exceeded, by considerable measure, anything she had allowed herself to imagine when she had walked into Ashcroft Manor on a November evening, in a gown of faded rose, braced for another winter of being tolerated. Rowan Knights did not save her by placing her above others. He saved her by seeing her clearly, by refusing to let a lie serve as a legacy, and by standing, or in public and in private, for the truth of what she was. Thornfield stood. Edmund Kingswell faced the consequences of 20 years of manufactured cruelty, and found that the mechanisms of ruin he had built so carefully had a way of finding their way home. Benedict carried his old guilt forward into something better. Laura remained, cheerful and perceptive, and entirely indispensable. The warmth that ran through the colder rooms of the story, like a fire kept lit against the January dark. And in the quiet after scandal, after fire, after fear, after the long years of enduring invisibly, and the brief, shattering joy of being finally, fully seen, there was something stronger than reputation, stronger than society's approval, stronger than the cruelty of men who mistake power for worth. There was peace. There was truth. Or there was a child named after the man who had never deserved what had been done to him. And there was Clara, not rescued, not redeemed by someone else's mercy, but restored by her own courage, her own precision, her own refusal to become small in spirit, and by the love of a man who recognized, from the first moment he chose to see her, exactly what the world had been throwing away. It was never too late. It simply required the right conditions, and the courage to stay until they arrived. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Truly, stories like this live because people like you choose to carry them forward. Stay with us for the next story, because the next heart we follow may be even more wounded, more defiant, and even harder to forget. Until then, take care of your heart. And remember this: it is never too late to be chosen, and it is never too late to become unforgettable. What this story has really taught one: a person's worth doesn't expire with age. Clara Crawford's most valuable qualities, her precision, her composure, her courage, and her capacity for clear moral judgment, were not diminished by the years. If anything, they had been refined by them. Society's habit of treating a woman's age as a measure of her relevance is a cruelty that says everything about the society, and nothing true about the woman. 2. Respect is more transformative than pity. Rowan did not offer Clara charity. He offered her a fair position, honest acknowledgement, and the simple decency of being taken seriously. It was this, not grand gestures or declarations, that gave her the ground on which to rebuild. There is a profound difference between helping someone because you pity them and helping someone because you see their value. Only the second carries dignity for both parties. 3. Societies often protect polished cruelty unless someone challenges it openly. Kingswell operated for over 2 decades because he understood how to make his cruelty look like reasonableness, and how to make his victims look like the problem. He was not challenged because challenging him was socially costly. The people who finally brought him down were those willing to absorb that cost. Rowan, Clara, Laura, Beatrice, and a handful of women who had been silent for a long time and chose not to be silent any longer. 4. To quiet competence can be more powerful than social charm. Clara didn't fight Kingswell with declarations or social maneuvering. She fought him with ledgers, lease agreements, accurate reading, and patience. The evidence she assembled in the correspondence room was the weapon that ended him. Brilliance performed for an audience is impressive. Brilliance applied to the actual problem is effective. 5. Love is strongest when it is rooted in truth, dignity, and choice. Clara did not accept Rowan because she needed to be saved. She accepted him because she chose to, from a position of growing strength, with clear eyes, knowing exactly who he was and what she was choosing. And he chose her in the same manner, not because she needed him, but because he could not imagine a life more worth living than one spent beside her. Now, this is what love looks like when it is real.